Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome into today's webinar. Today is going to be a live event. We're going to be doing demonstration style. We've done some of these before, but this will be the first time we talk about demonstrating our m-VROC or our extensional type viscometer. And we decided it was a good time because in the past, that particular flow channel was only compatible with our manual instrument, the m-VROC, but probably about 3 months ago or so, we made it compatible with our automated initium system. So you can run the extensional type measurement on either of those units. So we'll talk about the extensional chip a little bit, just in case you haven't been able to attend some of our previous webinars where we went into a lot of the details, equations, theory. We'll recap the necessary components there, just in case you're not familiar with it. And then we'll get into the demo, more practical discussion, and what to expect from the data, because it's going to look differently than the standard uniform flow channel. So that's kind of the agenda for today. And also helping me out, joining me are my colleagues, test engineer Sid, and then sort of behind the scenes is our application scientist, Christian, and he's going to be keeping an eye on the questions. So please ask some questions as we move along, and so we can address those in real time. That'll help make it more valuable to everyone watching. So he'll keep an eye on that and let us know when questions come in. So let's, Christian, if you could share my screen. I'm going to just go through a couple of slides real quickly. And this is just the review that I mentioned. So everything's up. So this is just a review on the extensional chip in case you were in case you haven't seen some of our other webinars or application notes. So viscosity is, in the general sense, the resistance to flow, and specifically it's defined as a stress response to some particular rate of continuous deformation. So you can change the type of viscosity that you're measuring by changing this type of deformation that you're imposing, and this will also result in a different type of stress response. And for our technology, the way we change the type of continuous deformation and therefore the type of viscosity is by changing the flow channel geometry. So we change the geometry of our microfluidic flow channel to change this type of deformation that we're imposing. So perhaps most of you are familiar with our uniform flow channel, which we use to obtain steady shear viscosity. However, we do have a flow channel, which we generally refer to as the extensional channel or the m-VROC, where we now have introduced a hyperbolic contraction-expansion in the center of the flow channel. And this is going to introduce an extensional component to the deformation. Now, just to be completely clear, this is going to be what we refer to as a mixed flow. It's not going to be pure extensional deformation, because we still have the fluid being confined by this glass flow channel. So no slip boundary conditions still apply for the majority of fluids. And so there's going to be, in addition to this extensional component, a steady shear component too. And we talked some more about that in some of our previous webinars. There are some situations where you can separate those two and get it to be more focused on the extensional component, but that's kind of outside the scope of today's talk. We're more interested in the more practical information today, but if you're interested, you can find that. So then also just to sort of round out the discussion on our technology and remind you of what data looks like for the uniform flow channel, so that you understand there's going to be some differences when we start looking at data from the extensional channel. So our technology, m-VROC, which stands for viscometer rheometer on a chip, is composed of the microfluidic flow channel, which I just mentioned. And in this case, we're going to be looking at the uniform channel and how we deal with that before we move into the extensional one. And this is combined with MEMS, so microelectromechanical sensors. So we have 4 pressure sensors spaced along the base of the flow channel. And this is basically how we're going to measure the stress. So the way this works is it's a controlled strain or controlled rate type of instrument. So we're controlling the flow rate that moves through the flow channel. And from this flow rate and the geometry of the channel, we can calculate the shear rate. And what we're measuring with these MEMS at the base of the flow channel is the pressure drop across the flow channel. And we use this pressure gradient again, in combination with the dimensions of the flow channel to calculate the shear stress. So then we have shear stress and shear rate, controlling rate. We're essentially, in effect, measuring stress, and then we can calculate shear viscosity. So the hyperbolic contraction expansion is going to change things up a little bit. And before I get into how that is, I just wanted to quickly try to explain why this hyperbolic contraction expansion zone actually introduces an extensional component to the deformation. So what it actually does is, so if you remember back, when we talk a lot about the shear rate is a velocity gradient, and it's a gradient perpendicular to flow. So the presence in this geometry change is to impose a velocity gradient in the direction of flow. So to understand how that can be, if you know that the volumetric flow rate is constant throughout the system, this is going to be essentially the cross-sectional area times the linear velocity at any particular position along the flow path. So volumetric flow rate is constant. So if we see an abrupt change in this cross-sectional area, then that means the linear velocity has to increase as we move into this contraction zone. So that means now we have this particular derivative, which is non-zero, and this is defined as the extensional rate. And so you can imagine as the fluid element enters into this zone, it's going to act to stretch or elongate it. So that's why this particular type of geometry will produce an extensional component to the deformation. And you can see here a theoretical view of what you would expect this velocity to look like in the direction of flow as we enter the constriction zone. So one other difference here is that this particular type of deformation is going to generate a different stress. It's not shear stress. In this case, it's actually a normal stress difference. So this is, you can imagine then, this fluid element that enters in here will basically be compressed and elongated simultaneously. And this first normal stress difference is going to be the difference between the tension and compression. And that's what we're going to be, that will be relevant when we're doing the calculation.
1 second, Stacy. We're just going to get this mic set up really quick.
I guess perhaps we're having problems with sound, so we're going to pause for
Okay.
a second.
I think we're good. That's all
Okay.
it was. Thank you.
All right. Hopefully sound is better now for everyone, now that we have our microphone here. Okay, so just as a first peek as to how things will look different when we start generating data in a moment. So I had already mentioned the nature of the geometry of the m-VROC, or the extensional channel. And the way it's set up is we have our pressure sensors, 2 prior to the center zone and 2 following the zone. So now when we look at the pressure drop across the length of the flow channel, unlike the uniform channel where we have a linear relationship when all is well, in the case of the extensional chip, what happens is you have a more significant pressure drop across the flow channel region, or across pressure sensors between 2 and 3. So now we're never going to see a nice linear relationship across all 4 sensors. We'll always have this more substantial drop in the center portion of the flow channel. And we'll talk about it a little later when we get to using this particular flow channel on our initium, where we have what we refer to as pre-run diagnostics. So one of the tests to make sure everything was well for the uniform channel on our automated system is what is the R-squared value of this pressure drop across the channel. So now that's no longer going to be relevant because we don't have that. That's not the nature of this pressure drop across the channel with our constriction. So don't worry too much about these equations. I just wanted to point out that our software handles the differences in the calculations that exist. Because we can't place the pressure sensors exactly at the entry and exit of this constriction or expansion zone, we do have to do a slight extrapolation to actually get what is that pressure drop across the contraction expansion, which we refer to as delta P sub C. So that's what we use in the calculations of the extensional viscosity. So just to quickly gloss over this, the extensional viscosity, as I mentioned, it's that normal stress difference now. It's not shear stress, it's the normal stress difference because of that simultaneously compression and tension on the fluid element divided by the extensional rate. So now that's the gradient of the velocity in the direction of flow. So the extensional rate is very similar to when we calculate the shear rate. It's the volumetric flow rate, and then all of the parameters for the geometry of the flow channel. So length of this constriction expansion, channel depth, which we refer to as H, and then the width, both within the constriction and then prior to the constriction. First normal stress difference comes from this pressure drop. Ideally, we'd want to be able to separate out the extensional component versus the steady shear contribution, because remember, it's a mixed flow environment. There are instances that we discussed in some of the previous webinars where you can obtain a better estimate for the extensional contribution here, but oftentimes, and the default for the software is to just use the whole delta p sub c to calculate the normal stress. And then finally, the Henke strain is just, for our geometry, it's just related to the two width of the channel. In reality, what this is the total sort of net deformation that the fluid element experiences during the experiment. And this is fixed by the geometry, so we can change by changing the flow rate, the extensional rate, but sort of the final destination, the total maximum strain that's experienced by these fluid elements is always fixed by this Henke strain value. So these are some of the values that we're going to be looking at, then slightly different than when we do the steady shear experiment. We're looking at extensional viscosity and extensional rate. We do have multiple extensional flow channels, just for your information. It's a little different than our uniform channels where we can vary the channel depth. For the case of the extensional channels, we have one fixed geometry. So all of these parameters that I've listed here that are diagrammed down here are fixed. There is no channel depth variability. However, we do have variation in the pressure sensors. So you can have a more, and the labeling in terms of A, B, C, and E is the same type of labeling we use for the uniform channels. So we can have a more sensitive chip where the max pressure is 12 kilopascals or something, able to handle higher pressures up to 1800 kilopascals. Okay, so with that said, I think we're going to now move into the demo portion. So we'll just take a moment here to switch computers and get back to the webcam. Okay. So we're probably going to have to move the camera a little bit because we don't have quite the broad range here. But this is basically an example of a flow channel that goes into all of our chips. This happens to be a uniform one, but these also exist, as I just described, with that constriction in the center. And now the m-VROC is available to be compatible with either our manual instrument, the m-VROC, or our automated system, which we refer to as the initium, and this is the initium 1 Plus. The challenge with adding a new chip to the inventory on the initium is that we have to create new protocols, mainly cleaning protocols to handle that chip type. So that's why we kind of add chips to the initium when customers request them, because there's a lot of development involved in getting that clean up to speed. And in this case, we had to change a lot of software features to do the new calculations and do the diagnostics. So what we're going to do is essentially run a sample and then walk you through how the diagnostics have changed, and then we'll start taking a look at how the data looks differently when we're doing the extensional type of measurement. And then we'll move on to show you the analogous experiment on our manual system. So what I'm going to do is, sorry to be jumping onto the camera here. Just in the interest of time, so obviously we could certainly run the sample I'm running with our auto sampler, using our vial racks here, and use the auto sampler to pick it up and inject it. But in the interest of time, it's a little faster if I manually inject, and then this is a good time to quickly discuss the option of manual injection. So it's very simple, straightforward, particularly with the sample I'm running. So I'm running a 1% hyaluronic acid solution. So it's not exceptionally viscous, somewhat viscous towards the lower end of rates, and very shear thin. So you generally want to try to load these, and like I said, this one was pretty straightforward to load, without any bubbles in the test syringe. And then good practices are to clean off the tip or the needle of the syringe and sort of blow it off, so that we don't have any dust. So now we're ready to get started, but what we're going to do first is talk a little bit about, and Sid's going to jump in here, he's going to talk a little bit about how diagnostics had to change, because remember, we can no longer look for an R-squared value of 1 to give us confidence that everything's operating, and then also discuss a little bit about how we had to change the cleaning protocols for the extensional chips, because as you can imagine, that very significant narrowing of the channel can cause some issues with cleaning, particularly for some high viscosity or even things with elasticity.
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, so as Stacy mentioned, the pressure profiles of a regular chip is in a linear format. So when we're calculating the diagnostics, we're looking for how linear the graph is. We're looking for an R-squared above 0.998. The goal of these diagnostics is to ensure everything along the flow path is okay. Generally, if we're running some high viscous samples or we're kind of using some tricky samples, we can get some clogs in the flow path. So the diagnostics ensure before you're running every single sample that you're going to have a good measurement set. So the main difference that we made for the m-VROC chip was we had to scrap the idea of using the R-squared values and look at the sensor readings on the leading and the following sensors. So the first pressure sensor and the last pressure sensor. So when we're looking at these two flow paths, we have two flow paths. We have one that goes backwards from the cell, so from the reservoir side through the cell. And then we have a forward path, which goes from the syringe through the cell and to the waste. So in either scenario, we can see that if there is a clog either upstream or downstream, that we're either not getting enough pressure going to the chip or we're getting too much pressure where it will overpressure because of the clog. So to address these two things, instead of looking at the R-squared value, we decided to look at the leading and the last sensor. So based on some empirical testing, we found that when the clog is serious, we'll see a difference, a pressure difference on the sensors by about 10%. So we created a diagnostic test where we were looking at the reference leading values. And if there is a difference of 10%, either 110% or 90%, we would call this a fail. And we did this both for the forward pass and the reverse pass. And that's really it for the diagnostics. So the trickiest part about this was doing the testing to see what are the values that fall within a regular range. So we have to test a variety of different chips, a variety of different initiums to see is that 10% enough to catch true clogs versus just differences between the different sensors. The other different thing that we did for the m-VROC chip was the cleaning protocol. So as Stacy alluded to earlier, because of the contraction and expansion zones, we have a lot of gunk that may build up in kind of those corners based on the image that Stacy showed before. There's a few different ways we can kind of counteract this. One is to heat the cleaning process. The higher temperatures sometimes help dissolve some of the samples. Introducing a soak time, so allowing the sample to fill the chip, letting it soak, allowing the solvent to break down some of the sample is another good way. And we have these options in our standard cleaning protocols as well, but when we did our testing, we found that we were still leaving some residue on the contraction and expansion points. So conjunction with the temperature and the soaking, we also introduced a reverse flow path. So this allows the sample to go through the forward path, so from the syringe to the cell, and then backwards as well from the reservoir to the cell. And kind of the combination of flowing it back and forth combined with the high temperature and the soaking is how we developed our cleaning protocol. Okay.
Okay, I'll just make one more comment on cleaning. So the sample we chose today, which is the hyaluronic acid sample, this is very easy to clean. It's very water soluble, no particular issues. But when we were working on developing some experiments with guar gum, so that's a natural polymer polysaccharide generally high molecular weight. We had some of these issues that Sid described with the cleaning. So depending on what sample you're working with, you may want to get a little creative with your cleaning, which we did for the guar gum. So to clean that out, actually what we ended up doing is we sort of dug into the chemistry of the guar gum, and we found that it will degrade at under acidic conditions at higher temperatures. So our cleaning protocol for that varied a bit from our aqueous system, our aqueous cleaning series of solvents, where we used acetic acid, about 10% acetic acid was the first one, and we cleaned at an elevated temperature. So, if you have some sort of challenging samples of that sort, we're happy to work with their customers and develop the, unique cleaning protocols to handle them. So we found that, that really flushed out the guar gum because we were essentially degrading it during the process so that it didn't build up so much in those zones. Okay. So now we're going to get ready and do the manual injection so that we can take a look at the data. Just a quick point, we're working on the Model 1 Plus. Any of our customers that have the Model 1 unit, if you upgrade, make sure you upgrade your manual injection syringe because the needle length is different. And the needle length on the old one is too long and can cause problems and hit the test syringe piston. So did we want to run the diagnostics or just skip that?
We can run it when we do the full job.
Okay. So just a quick review. So I guess maybe now I guess I'm going to manually inject. So I'll start run here, and then we'll talk about some of the software issues once we start sharing the screen. So the nice thing about the automated unit, hopefully you can still hear, because it's making noise, is it has what we refer to as these pre-run diagnostics. So we can determine, is everything okay with our flow channel and then all of the other flow paths? Because you have issues with, perhaps something's not tight enough, or something's clogged elsewhere outside the channel. And it just gives you confidence that everything's ready to go before you actually do your testing. So we're just going through that quickly before we inject. While we're waiting, I'll mention that although because the sample is pretty straightforward, I was easily able to draw up the sample in the 100 microliter manual injection syringe. But for some more challenging samples, and this holds true when you're doing the m-VROC testing where you manually fill the syringe, you can do some backfill techniques. So for the 100 microliter syringe, using a positive displacement pipette of about 100 microliters, it fits very nicely in the back and is very easy to backfill. And then likewise, for example, we'll talk a little more about the m-VROC when we get to that. But that's an option as well if your samples are tricky. Any questions coming in, Christian?
No.
So we're almost there. Oh, yes.
So we have one question here that popped up. So it states, so I noticed you have done measurements other than biopharma. Would you recommend anything specific with extensional?
Well, so far, the customers that seem to be most interested in our extensional technology are paints, coatings, inks, and the oil and gas industry. However, that's so far just the most common requests. But anytime you have a process, for example, where you have that extensional type of deformation or mixed flow type of deformation, then it could be relevant to you.
The temp?
Yeah. Okay, just in the interest of time, I'm going to switch off the temperature control. Oh, yeah.
So we have another 2 questions from the same person. The next one reads, who should be reviewing extensional viscosity? And that's followed by, when should we do extensional versus shear?
So this goes back to your application. You have to sort of look at your application and say, is there some extensional deformation that exists? So like I said, the paints and coatings have been a popular request because in spraying or even rolling the roller action of the paint, as you separate the roller from, say, the wall or whatever surface you have, there's an elongation of the fluid elements or filaments. So you have to think about, does that type of thing happen to your sample at either during the application or during the processing conditions. So you really want to look and understand your application or processing and see if that type of deformation exists. And likewise with the steady shear.
Another question, a couple of questions just came in. The first one states, you mentioned earlier flow is not pure extensional. In real world conditions, is flow purely extensional?
There are some conditions where it is. Many cases, it's not pure extensional, it's a combination. So anytime you have, say, a nozzle structure where you have a change in the diameter, say a narrowing, tapering, then again, you're simultaneously shearing and extending. In the oil and gas industry, if you're injecting fluids into, rock structures that sort of narrow and expand over and over again, that's another natural environment where you don't have the pure extension, but a mixed flow. We just like to point it out. It's not necessarily a negative. We just don't want to have anyone think that they can do very theoretical type analysis of their data. So I think what we're going to do, Christian, if we can pause on the questions there, is share our screen here. So this would be Sid. And then, or I guess actually I need to manually check first. So we'll just hold on one moment. So trust me, the software is telling me to manually inject. It's a little hard to show everything at the same time. But so it's warning me to manually inject. And so the particular needle on the syringe is designed specifically to fit in this auto sampler, or I'm sorry, in the injection port. And you just press it down as far as it can go, and then you think you're okay. And so now I'm just slowly going to introduce the sample so as not to introduce bubbles. And of course, you just have to gauge this. More viscous samples with some elasticity, you have to take some more care, but this sample is not so bad. Okay, so I just tell the software now that I've injected. And we leave the syringe in until the test syringe piston moves underneath. Otherwise, we can have issues with bubbles being backed by the test syringe piston. So everything looks good. Yes.
We have another question here. It's for protein formulations, which viscometer would you prefer?
For proteins, we generally prefer to use the initium. It, for most cases, can get us the range of shear rates that we would want for most samples, and it uses the least volume and is really the most convenient. And we have the ability to recover samples easily on the automated system. So if you need to get some of that back after testing, you can do that as well.
And another question, are the extensional chips different from shear chips? Would you need both?
So the extensional chips are different. So we kind of did a quick review of that at the very beginning. Perhaps you jumped on to the call late. So what we're going to do is we're going to, before we accept that, well, I guess it takes a second after, so accept, and then we'll switch to share the software. So now what we see is data coming up here, and you can see immediately we don't have the same type of pressure drop across the flow channel that we would otherwise. So you can see there's a more significant decrease across the central zone. However, much of the other results look very similar. Basically, we're looking for a transient to plateau out and have a nice plateau so that we can average the data over that plateau. And one thing to keep an eye on when you're looking at the pressure drop is, does the slope between the first two sensors and the last two sensors look consistent? Because that's a good gauge that you don't have any secondary flows, which we didn't really touch on, but another issue that can crop up with the extensional chip is the presence of the secondary flows. So anyway, this data looked very good. We had a nice plateau for everything. Good, sufficient data points to average. Typical pressure drop across the flow channel. And then what we see is that, similar to what happens for hyaluronic acid in steady shear, we see a thinning with increased extensional rate. So although it says shear rate on the plot here, because this software is meant to handle extensional and shear rate, this is kind of a tricky thing for the software to change. But what we're looking at is extensional viscosity versus extensional rate. And as I said, this thins just as it would under uniform shear. So now we've moved on to cleaning, but I think we have an idea of how this will appear differently, mainly the pressure gradient. Did we have another question before we move on to the next?
Not at the moment. No additional questions yet.
Okay.
But I will let you know.
Okay, so just to make a final comment on the initium, we could have used the auto sampler for this sample and many others. It's just in the interest of time, we were doing the manual injection, which of course, if you have tricky samples, is doable on the initium. So, if you have the, interest with the m-VROC, it's now compatible on the automated system, and there's certainly plenty of advantages for that. So now we're going to move over to the manual unit, just so that you can see the other options that are available to you for this type of extensional testing. I'm going to keep the camera on for a moment. Just while we load things up and show this. So we always have to manually fill our syringe when we're dealing with the m-VROC or e-VROC as it is in this case. So just a quick tip when you're loading your particular syringe here, using a fluidic adapter if you're going to draw up the sample as opposed to backfill, which is also an option in this case, makes it a little neater and doesn't, and then you don't have any issues with pulling fibers off with the threaded tip from our fiberless wipes. I think we have a question.
The question reads, is a special initium dedicated to extensional needed?
No, basically just like all the units, you can take chips in and out. So this is the initium style, here's initium style chip. And so it just pops in and out of the unit just as the m-VROC or e-VROC style pops in and out. So one unit can handle uniform and extension.
The one thing that was different was that with the m-VROC on this manual unit, you needed a different software, the m-VROC control software. The initium can automatically, based on the chip that's plugged in, determine if it's an extensional chip or a non-extensional chip.
Okay. Looks like a question.
So we have a couple of questions here that just came up. The first one is, do you have data of the sample in the low rate Newtonian region along with the thinning region? And then it states, also, do you have the shear Newtonian viscosity of the test sample to confirm the 3 times Jordan relationship?
Okay, so for the sample that we measured, we didn't, generally, if you have a highly shear thinning sample, so I'll start with the first part of that question. If you have a highly shear thinning sample, generally you need multiple flow channels to access as much as the plateau and then as much as the thinning region that you can. So for our quick experiment, we only had one chip inserted, so we'd need likely to use multiple chips to try to get plateau and shear thinning regions or extensional thinning regions. And that general statement applies to both the uniform channel and the m-VROC channel. So generally multiple chips to get the full profile. So we could have also, and we have in the past, measured the hyaluronic acid on a uniform chip to get the steady shear values and compare those to the extensional. And we could then calculate the Troughton ratio, which is just the ratio of extensional to steady shear. So you might want to, I don't want to go into it too much. You might want to look at one of our previous webinars, but for the case of our flow channel, even when we subtract off the steady shear component, which you can do for a Newtonian pipe fluid, we do get a higher Troughton ratio than the expected, say 3 to 4. In one of our previous webinars, we discussed why we think that is. And I'll just try to quickly do it. It's hard to do without a graph to point to, but if you remember the graph that I initially showed, where we were looking at the velocity profile as a function of position as we moved into that extensional or the contraction-expansion zone. So theoretically, what you would have is basically no extensional deformation until you hit that entry. And then once you were exiting that expansion zone, then you would go back to having no extensional component. What we found from, and there's a publication referenced in one of our previous webinars that actually did some flow velocimetry to look at the velocity profile as a function of position along the flow path. And what we found is that the extensional deformation starts a little sooner than we thought, and it's a little more extreme than we thought. However, that's going to differ from fluid to fluid, so it's not simple to have a general or universal correction to it. So we can get the Troughton ratio if we use both types of flow channels, but as previously discussed in quite a bit more detail, we're not going to see the exact 3 to 4 that you would for, say, the Newtonian sample. All right. Okay, so I loaded the sample. We're using a slightly larger syringe. That's one benefit to using the manual option, is that you have different syringe volumes that you could use, whereas on the initium we're at 100 microliters alone. So now, just to show you before we start up the software, just remove the fluidic adapter, dab off any excess fluid, blow off any fibers or particles, and then we're going to put, we can sort of rotate. So this is just, let's see, the tip of the syringe is threaded, which then threads into the entry of the chip, and the syringe sits into a jack. Again, we're not going to use temperature control because it's going to be quite a bit noisy, and then we don't want to wait for it to reach temperature. We just put it in. We move the block close to the piston, as close as we can, before we open up the chip entry point. We do that because you never want to manually yourself push any fluid through the flow channels. It's very easy, even if you think you're being gentle, it's very easy to blow out the sensors and try to do it manually. So never clean it that way. You never want to do that. You always want to allow the instrument to do the control motion. And then we just secure it in. And typically, we would be using the temperature control, so we have the ability to connect to a circulating fluid bath. Okay, so now we're going to go well, let me give a closure. Okay, unfortunately my computer's not letting me expand the software screen larger, but hopefully it's visible to everybody. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to, again, we don't want to be the one to start moving the piston with our hand, so we're going to let the instrument find basically the piston. So we're going to push this here to get everything started, and it's going to move that block that you saw a moment ago when we contacted. But it's not going to extension, give it some other information. Okay, so I restarted the software, so it sort of deleted some information I had. So the one thing you want to do is introduce sample ID that you just want to set around acid. Estimating viscosity isn't so important because you kind of have to scope things out on your own. I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. And then you want to tell it what syringe volume am I using, because unlike the initium, we have a variety of syringe volumes that you can use with the m-VROC or e-VROC beyond just 100 milliliters. So I picked the volume I have, and then the volume of fluid that I put into the syringe, so I filled it up. And now to do what I wanted to do, if I'm going to go, I need to put in some sort of rate value. Actually, just, no, this should be empty. That should be all right. So now we can allow the block to find the tip or the end of the piston rod.
We have a question, Stacey.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of questions. The first one is a question regarding the m-VROC viscometer. Depending on which factor should we select the flow rates, like if we don't know the viscosity of the sample?
Okay, so our plunger was contacted. So generally, if you don't know the viscosity of the sample, it's a little tricky with the m-VROC to try to use this feature where you put in estimated viscosity. So what I would recommend is you start very low on the flow rate range, and then just kind of work your way up until you sort of move into a zone that's reasonable. So that reasonable zone is always going to be 85 to 95% full scale pressure. So you really just have to sort of start scoping things out because it's a little tricky to, let's say you have the steady shear data and you need to try to convert to what you would think the extensional viscosity would be. That can be challenging, particularly with non-Newtonian fluids where we know the Trout ratio could be, quite high. So that's sort of the, reality of it is you're going to scope things out.
There's one more question if you have time right now. So that states, when testing at high shear, how do you determine if there are secondary flows?
Okay, remind me to answer that in a second. I'm going to start the priming of the chip. So we didn't really talk about it a lot because we didn't go through how we created our testing protocol on initium. But the first thing you generally have to do is what we call prime the chip or prime the flow channel. So that means you either, in the case of the m-VROC, where maybe you store your channels with aquat or, some other particular cleaning fluid that you like to leave in there, or perhaps it's dry. We need to either displace that fluid or hydrate and fill the flow channel. So let me do that before I get back to that question. So I'm just picking a rate that should be okay based on my experiments that we just performed on the initium. And you can see that the view of the software, although it's a different format, the software, it really is showing us the same information. We have the transient curve, the pressure profile, we're monitoring temperature, and then as we acquire data, it sort of fills in data points here as a function of extensional rate or temperature if that's what you're varying. So you can see again, we have a nice pressure drop that we have. It's what we expect with this particular constriction in the center where we have a more rapid drop. And then we also have a nice viscosity plateau where we can average over data. And in this case, we're not controlling temperature, but you can monitor how stable it is under temperature stable. So in terms of secondary flows, I would do two things to keep an eye on the secondary flows. One is look at what is the pressure drop between sensors 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So in the absence of secondary flows, you can actually use these to calculate the steady shear viscosity in that uniform zone of the flow channel. And if those values are nearly equivalent, then that's one indication that you don't have any sort of secondary flows that might be disrupting those pressure sensors near the entry and exit point. The second thing is you can calculate the Reynolds number for this particular geometry for your flow conditions and the sample that you're looking at. So if you go to one of our previous webinars, we give you basically the correct expression for the Reynolds number, and we presented it for our uniform channel and our extensional channel. It turns out that in the extensional channels, it can be more sensitive to these secondary flows or the turbulence. So if you're familiar with Reynolds number and that transition from laminar to turbulent flow, for the uniform channel, that transition Reynolds number is going to be somewhere around 2,500. It varies a little bit depending on the source, but ballpark 2,300, 2,500. For the extensional chip, it actually tends to be more in practice 10 to 20. So a couple of orders of magnitude lower. So it is, you have to sort of be on the lookout for that a little more than you would the uniform channel. In fact, I've never seen any turbulence or secondary flows in our uniform channel, but I have seen it in our extensional channel at that, empirically determined Reynolds number about 10 to 20. So looks like we filled the channel quite nicely here. Let's just then do a few more rates. So we do have the option to set up a quick rate sweep. So let's see. Go back here for a second. So in the software, you can see the live outputs where you see all the details that I mentioned. It also gives you a tabulated summary. So if we had done multiple rates, we would have seen all the information tabulated here. And then if we did have temperature control, we could monitor all the temperature data on this particular tab. So let's go ahead and do a quick sweep. So 200 is about 20% full scale. So I'm going to set up something from about 100 to 600 for the extensional rates, and I think we'll do it on 5 points. So you can do this in a log, and step along between 100 and 600 with a log on a log scale, or linear, and you can either do ascending or descending. So low to high or high to low rates. So I'm going to create a new sweep, and you can see when I did that, it populated the rates between 100 and 600. So we've already primed the chip, we already have the piston in contact with the block. So now we're going to just go ahead and start the step.
We have a couple of questions here. So the first one is, we are getting the varied results each time with the same sample with m-VROC viscometer. Could you please explain why this is happening?
So I guess, in reality, I'd want to ask you some questions about your sample and how you're doing your testing. Before we get back to the question, I just wanted to draw your attention here. So you can see that this is a very expanded scale, so this noise isn't a huge concern because we're not fluctuating as much as it really looks. It's really zoomed in. But you can see the consistent nature of this type of profile and the consistency between the slopes of the pre and post constriction. And then if we show all data points, you can see again we're getting that shear thinning or extensional type thinning behavior with the hyaluronic acid as we saw on our automated unit. Okay, so you keep measuring the same sample over and over again and you get different data. So I would, if you've confirmed that your system is performing properly with the standard oil or another viscosity standard, which we recommend doing regularly. So if you're confident that the chip is healthy and your pump is functioning and all is well there, and that's the first thing to check. You want to check the health of the system with the standard oil where you know the viscosity, or could be a aqueous-based standard too. The second thing is then to start looking at your sample a little critically. Ask yourself, is it homogeneous? Can I make it homogeneous? Does it phase separate? And then also, is it stable as a function of time? So things can, aggregate or degrade over time depending on their environment. So you might want to look into homogeneity of your sample and then stability of your sample as well.
There's another question. So this one states, what is the volume comparison between the initium and the m-VROC?
So the initium, as I think we mentioned before, we only operate the initium with 100 microliters syringe. So the most sample we ever really load generally is 90 microliters. And we haven't, the extensional chip is new, so we haven't done a lot of testing with it with lower volumes than the 90 microliters. So we don't yet know what kind of data we could get if we scale back. So just to clarify, the initium itself, the bare minimum you can put in a vial for the auto sampler to load is 26 microliters. And that's, you know, going to limit the amount of data you can get, but that's the bare minimum. We haven't gone that low on the extensional chip, so I don't know if that's even appropriate, because it is a larger channel depth and the nature of the test is a bit different, and we may need more volume or time to reach a steady state and get good data. So at the moment, I'd say 90 microliters is what you want on the initium. And then on the manual or the m-VROC, it really kind of depends at what rates you want to operate at. If you want to work with one of the more sensitive chips and try to get down in, say, a plateau region where you're operating at a lower flow rate, then you're going to need less volume. And, you know, I would ballpark say it could be similar, 100 microliters. But then the more data you want, the more higher flow rates you want, the more volume you're going to need. So it's a little harder to narrow things down on the m-VROC, the manual system, without knowing what kind of rate range you want to operate at and how many rates do you want. Okay, so you can see just a quick view here. Like I mentioned, we can view all of the data at once. We can see how this profile has evolved as we bumped up the rate, the extensional rate or flow rate in this case, and then we can again see the extensional thinning that exists here. And we have a nice monitor here keeping us alert to the fact, you know, where are we on the percent full scale, so that we don't operate too low and we don't overpressure. Although there is, like all of our instruments, they have a built-in sort of security system so that you won't continue to operate once you've exceeded a particular pressure, or put the brakes on everything to protect the unit. So I think, you know, that's pretty much all I want to say about the testing. I will comment on how we clean the m-VROC, which is different than our initium. So the initium is automated cleaning, and the m-VROC, basically, we would want to, just like we loaded our syringe with our test sample, what we would do is load an additional syringe with our cleaning solvents, and then pump those through using a testing protocol at the appropriate rate. And again, with the extensional chip, we recommend, if necessary, getting a bit creative, and that would be soaking times, temperatures. You know, if you know something degrades your samples, like I explained with the guar gum earlier, those degraded under acidic conditions when you warm them up. So, you know, think about how you want to clean out your samples, and really consider, you know, doing some soaking and maybe elevated temperatures, so long as you're not, say, denaturing protein or something along those lines, or making something insoluble by heating it. So I think with that, we'll just pause and see if there's any additional questions, and then we'll wrap it up. So it looks like we got a lot of the questions came in during the webinar, so that's great. Thank you for your participation there. As always, if you signed up, even if you weren't able to attend, we send out an email with the recording and any sort of slides that we may have shared, and then of course contact info if you had any questions. If you didn't think of the questions during the webinar, you can certainly follow up and get questions to our team here. We're happy to help. So thanks again for joining us, and we will be back in March. I think March, the topic we're planning on now is to talk about battery fluids and some new testing we were doing with rechargeable batteries. So come back at the end of March and join us for that.